Hello, welcome back to Talking Truth Ministries, where my goal is to share the truth to the best of my ability and to share the good news of Jesus Christ as he is the way, the truth, and the life. So I'm going to read chapter 6 of The History of the Origin of the Trinity by Robert McFarland. In this chapter, a search will be made for any linkage between the King of Salem and the patriarch Abraham. It will be necessary to establish some dates to find out exactly when they met. In order to do this, we will use the chronology of the scripture as recorded in the book of Genesis. Genesis 5 details the generations from the first man, Adam, until Noah. Genesis 10 is known as the generations of the sons of Noah. Several years ago, this author pastored a church that had a building exactly 35 feet wide, inside measurement. After considerable study and calculations, we arrived at the church building early for one weeknight Bible study service. We tied a heavy gauge twine across the front of the building and marked up 7 60-inch increments. These represented 1,000-year intervals in the overall spectrum of the total of the 35 feet. Then we placed several names on blank sheets of paper and had a large pile of paper clips on hand. Several young people were drafted into service to assist in this manner. As one would read the scripture, giving years to each name, for example, Adam is 930 years, the calculations were made accordingly. 930 years translated to 55.8 feet, or 55.8 inches, or 60 times 0.930 equals 55.8 inches. One tall young man pulled the Stanley tape out and began the measuring. One assistant placed a paper clip on 0. Another clip was placed on the 56-inch point. The looping string with the name Adam was placed in that loop. This procedure was proceeded for the number of names we were using that evening. We eventually got all the way across the 7,000 years, and at the completion, everyone was able to visualize the relative lifespans and their closeness and distances from each other. We had the flood, the day of Pentecost, and several other special dates. This presentation enabled everyone to visualize where we all were in the large picture of the week of man's day. We will now try to reconstruct some of that material to bring this relationship between Abraham and Melchizedek into reality. We will simply use a page graph, not the scale, of course, to make a point of explanation for this chart. Adam lived 130 years and produced Seth, who lived 912 years total. Seth lived 105 years and produced Enos, who lived 905 years total, and so on throughout the lists. Adam, 930 years. 130, Seth, 912 years. 105 years was Enos, who lived 905 years. 90 years was Canaan, who lived 910 years. 70 years was Mahalalel, who lived 895 years. 65 years, Jared, who lived 962 years. 162 years was Enoch. He lived 365 years. 65 years was Methuselah, who lived 969 years. 187 years was Lamech at 777 years. All of these individuals were alive concurrently with Adam. Lamech was 56 years old when Adam died. These 8 individuals could, and in all probability did, sit and communicate with Adam from time to time about the garden and the good old days. Virtually all history passed through oral communication to the next generation, and obviously it never got any better than the actual experiential individual, Adam himself. The conjecture is what they spoke about. The fact is that they were all alive in the same time frame and could have spoken about anything. But humanity does have a way of developing and following habits that are still in practice today. So based on the practices that are in place today, it is more than probable that the discussion did, in fact, wander to the garden for an eyewitness account from grandfather Adam. Continuing 126 years after Adam died, Noah was born to a father who was 56 years old when Adam died. This means Noah's father had 56 years talking with the original creation of God. Excuse me. Adam also lived 726 years before the flood. Noah lived 500 years before he had children, the first of whom was Shem. Interestingly, Noah and Shem are the only two who crossed over the flood zone in this genealogy study. As to the veracity of the oral history, Noah could quote from his own father, who spoke directly with the original creation, Adam, and Shem could quote from his grandfather the same history. Now we will count from the flood. Noah was 600 when the flood occurred and lived 350 more years, a total of 950 years. Shem was 100 at the flood and lived another 500 years to 600 years. Arphaxad was 100 and lived 438 years. Salah was 35 and lived 433 years. 30 for Eber, 464 years. 34 for Peleg, 239 years. 30 for Reu, 239 years. 32 for Serug, 230 years. 30 for Nahor, 148 years. 29 for Terah, 205 years. 70 for Abraham, 175 years. All of these were current with Noah in his life. Abraham was 60 years old when Noah died. It is possible that Abraham was able to speak with the third from Adam, Lamech, at age 56 when Adam died, and passed history directly on to Noah, who was able to pass it directly to Abraham for 60 years till he died. Adam, Lamech, Noah, Abraham. Then there was, at 100, Isaac came along, and he lived 180 years, and then Isaac was 60 when Jacob was born, and he lived 147 years. Jacob would have been 15 years old when grandfather Abraham died. Isaac and Jacob were not afforded the privilege to go directly to the original sources of their father Abraham, but they would have fallen into a category of fourth from Adam through their father Abraham. As we have no authority or remaining record on the conversation between Abraham and Melchizedek as they met and communed after the return from the slaughter, we can only look to the scriptures to consider what happened after that meeting. We can only conjecture from this point onward, but there are some facts to support this conjecture. Abraham was called out of Ur of the Chaldees to go to a land that God would show him when he arrived there. Melchizedek was already there, and if he was in fact Shem, Noah's eldest son, with a name change upon entering the promised land, it would mean that God had a city named Peace on Mount Zion from earliest times and an active priest on site before Abraham was even born. Abraham left the nation that he referred to in modern times as the Let me say that again. Abraham left a nation that has been referred to in modern times as the cradle of civilization. Additional study reveals that it was also the cradle of multiple God worship. It cradled the worship of astrology. It cradled the worship of mysticism. It cradled the worship of humanism and many more. Now comes the conjecture based upon this bank of factual evidence. God was looking to develop a nation that would defy the multiple God worship system that had swept the world and introduce a Messiah in days to come. He needed a nation to break away and maintain a pure gene pool to cradle a church that would arrive a couple of thousand years downstream. He needed a man who would teach his children and their children's children about the one true God who reigns supreme over everything and everybody. He had that man in Adam, but that attempt failed at the tree. He had that man in Noah, but each generation downstream appeared to wax more evil than the one before. It passed to Shem, who is possibly also called Melchizedek, but 8 generations between Shem and Abraham were the cradle of idolatry. So he passed over all 8 generations and jumped directly to Abraham from Shem. The next chapter, Genesis 15, begins right after the Melchizedek blessing and is followed by a most unusual visitation from God directly to Abraham. Abraham was asleep and visited him and gave him an overview of many future events. He concluded with a covenant that was sealed in fire. On this note, the rabbis tell us that the animal sacrifice is cut in half, and as each piece is placed on either side of the passageway. After the covenant is made and agreed to by both parties, the fire is marched down the passageway between the cut pieces. Then the separated pieces were replaced back together and burned as a one-piece sacrifice, signifying that until both parties die, this covenant is valid. The basic covenant statements were: Abraham would not always be childless and would in fact bear a child. That child and residual offspring would eventually outnumber the stars of the heavens, and it would begin and happen in this land he had chosen, anytime also chosen by him. Adam's contemporaries created the need for a flood to clean the earth. Noah could only produce one generation that worshiped the Most High God, but God was accepting the risk that Abraham was going to produce a nation that would last about 2,000 years in its pure state and be ripe for the birth of a Messiah. He would need to maintain a constant guard, as every nation in that world had a growing multiplicity of gods. This author believes that God knew how to pick the winners. And that concludes chapter 6 at this time. Thank you for listening. God bless. Please hit the subscribe button.